Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai chapter 7, Halacha 1, and let's talk about chapter 7. Now, on Shabbat, you're not allowed to separate out tithes, whether it's going to be definite tevel or Demai. And the rabbis instituted this because if you're taking untithed produce that, it's going to be unfit for consumption, and then if you're going to tithe it, you're going to fix it so that you can make it fit for consumption. And if you're doing on this Shabbat, then it's like finishing something. It's like you're repairing a broken item. And it's basically like striking the final blow. Before, it wasn't ready to be used, and now it's finished. Now this is going to be a pile of chulin that you can use. So you're not allowed to tithe his produce. But the question is going to be coming up, well, what happens if you're going to be tithing things before? And what's going to be happening and there's a few situations where a person is going to realize on Friday that he has produce that he needs for Shabbat, it's untithed, and he's unable to tithe it before Shabbat, or in Halacha 1, where you're a guest at a meal. Let's say you have, like what we saw in chapter 4, Halacha 2, where it's going to be a mitzvah meal, and it's a shever baracha, and you're a chaver, and the host is an haaretz. What are you going to do? How do you do this? Where you're going to be tithing on Shabbat. Now, there's going to be two ways to handle this, and it's going to be basically whether you're going to believe that there's going to be brera or not. We know that brera is a maloket tanayim and amarim, and the principle of brera is stating that you can institute a legal process and immediately attach a designation to this retroactively by a later choice. Now, some people don't hold this way. And so let's say you have a case, before Shabbat, and you're going to be saying that the portion I will separate after the Shabbat is hereby designated as truma for the remaining produce. That's going to take effect immediately. And then after the Shabbat, when somebody actually goes and separates a portion, it's going to be clarified with brera retroactively that this portion was truma from the moment of declaration for Shabbat. But the validity of brera, again, is a maloket, and some people hold that you can't retroactively clarify things. So if you can't retroactively designate truma before the Sabbath on relying on identification after the Shabbat or on the Shabbat, then you're going to have a question, and you'd basically be saying that, like you'd be doing it before Shabbat, and you'd be saying the portion that I will separate on the Shabbos is hereby designated as truma. Now, this is not dependent on brera because it does not need to take effect retroactively. And basically, this designation started before. You started this process before, and now it takes effect on Shabbat when the correct portion is in front of you. So this is going to be the case where if you don't believe in brera, and these people reject brera, that's how you're doing it. You're starting the process beforehand so that you might actually be separating out some of your own tevel on behalf of something that you're going to be getting on Shabbat. And then on Shabbat, it's going to be a continuation of basically what you started before Shabbat, and you're not relying on something retroactive. All you're doing is you're saying that, now the correct portion is in front of me, and that's what it's been designated on. So these two ways have different advantages over the other, and we're going to be covering that in Chapter 7, Halacha 1, and also Chapter 7, Halacha 5. The interesting part is that in Chapter 7, Halacha 1, it's really going to be talking about just Demai. But in Chapter 7, Halacha 5, it's going to be talking about what happens when you're trying to do this separation with tevel. Now, the Mishnah was talking about a case in Halacha 1, and in the Art Scroll we're on 65a2, that you're invited on Shabbat, and that already has a lot of issues. How is it that a chaver is invited to the Am Haaretz's house on Shabbat? Let's assume it's for a mitzvah meal. But this case of the Mishnah has some broad implications. One of the implications could be that perhaps this is not as much of a chaver as you would think. It's just somebody who's careful about tithes, but he's not learned enough to know about things that are about Demai and Tahor. Now we know that, as we saw in chapter 2, Halacha 3, that a chaver who goes to the house of the haaretz has a problem, because not only does he have to worry about the tithes, he also has to worry about becoming Demai. And so a chaver is not allowed to go eat at a house of haaretz because he might become Demai as well as the tithes. This is talking about a case where either it's a mitzvah meal and you have to go to keep the peace, or it's a case where you have a person who wants to keep the tithes, but he does not keep the Torah issues. And so then over there, he's careful enough for tithes, but not careful enough for making sure the stuff is Demai, or he stays Tahor. So that can be part of what's going on here. The case here is, again, we're going to be really talking about cases of Demai. This is really just talking about Demai. And again, there's a lot of rabbinic leniencies on Demai. That's not going to be a case where you have definite tevel. The case in the Mishnah here is going to be talking about the case where you're doing it if you don't believe there's brera. And in the case of, that you do believe that there's brera. And in the case of tevel, you really can't rectify it if you believe that there's, because it's a deraita thing. You really, in the halacha, you can't do it with brera. So it's really going to become problematic with brera when you're going to try to make these designations, as you're going to see in chapter 7, halacha 5. The case over here is you're doing it on Demai. So let's get into it. The Gemara says, one who invites his fellow before Shabbat to eat with him on Shabbos, but the guest does not trust the host regarding maestros. The procedure is as follows. The guest should say before the Shabbos that 100th, which I will separate from my portion tomorrow on Shabbat, is hereby designated as Meiser Rishon, and let the rest of the Meiser, another 9 100ths, be next to it. In other words, it's pointing out a location of where this is going to be. And part of what we're seeing here is that this designation is representing the standard formula when you're tithing Demai. That's how you know we're talking about Demai here. And the novelty here is that the guest can make this stipulation before Shabbat. Now, on the basis of this pre-Shabbos declaration, the Meiser designation is taking immediate effect on Shabbat when the guest separates the Truma Meiser portion. In effect, all he's doing on the Shabbat is identifying the portion which he made with this designation before Shabbat. Okay? So he's not actually taking out designation on Shabbat. All he's doing is identifying the portion that he's already separated before. Okay? That's, again, going to be where the designation is not dependent on brera. In other words, there's not a retroactive clarification. All you're doing is you're saying that, this is the portion. I've identified the portion. So again, this is only working in a case where you believe that there is no brera. And again, this is going to be one long process that you've started before Shabbat. Now, one of the things is that the food didn't come into existence yet. In other words, they didn't serve it to you yet. So again, one of the things that you're doing here that you're keeping in mind for this is that you're identifying. You're just identifying the food that comes in front of you as part of this process that you've started before Shabbat, and you're not actually doing the declaration or the separation on Shabbat. So a little bit different, and that's how, even if somebody believes in brera, they're going to accept this. They're going to also say that, yeah, what you did is totally kosher. But we're talking about the more stringent view, which is that there is no brera. And so this is how somebody who says that there is no brera is going to do it. And again, you're doing this based upon Demai. You're not necessarily doing this in the same way as you would be for tevel. Tevel is going to be a little bit different. Again, this is a Derabanan thing, and tevel is going to be deraita. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, he then says that 100th that I made Meiser Rishon first is hereby made into Trumas Meiser for the Meiser Rishon. And he continues, and the Meiser Sheni for my portion is hereby designated on its north side or its south side, and is hereby deconsecrated upon the coin set aside for this purpose. In other words, he makes a declaration before Shabbat, including for the Meiser Sheni. He deconsecrates it onto the coins that are going to be there, and he's already locating the portion of the food that's going to be there. So he's saying, when the plate is served to me, the food that's in the north portion is going to be deconsecrated onto these coins that I set aside for this purpose. And all he's doing on Shabbat is just identifying where the food is on this north side. But again, the process is done beforehand, and this is only for Demai. Now, he's then going to eat the rest of the portion at Shabbat, and he's not worried that he's violating a tevel prohibition. Again, this is really dealing with somebody who holds that this is not dependent on brera with a retroactive clarification, and this is really like the more strict way to do it. And one of the ways to look at this is that if you're going to be doing this and you're going to be as a chaver going to the house of the haaretz, this is really going to be like the preferred way to be doing that. That's really how you have to read chapter 7, that these are really the preferred ways to be handling everything if you're going to be doing it. So the Gemara is going to qualify the Mishnah's ruling, and Rabbi Yochanan says that this Mishnah deals with a case of Demai, but with a regard to definite tevel, this procedure may not be followed. So the permit to designate the maestros in advance represents a special leniency with Demai, which is also going to be D'Rabbanan. And the Chazan Ish is going to say about this that Rabbi Yochanan infers from the Mishnah that it refers to Demai, as it omits the designation of Truma, which would be required in a case of definite tevel. So you notice that the Chazan Ish is pointing out that the Truma Gedola designation was not stated there. It was just the other stuff like Meiser Sheni. And so if this was a case of actual definite tevel, you would need to also separate out Truma Gedola. So this is again talking about an haaretz and Demai, and it's assumed that the Truma Gedola was separated. So the Chazan Ish also says that the Mishnah states that one who is invited by his fellow that he does not trust on tithes and maestros, and not a fellow he suspects regarding maestros. In other words, the implication is that this is somebody whose level of observance is unconfirmed, and the produce is going to be considered demai, not definite tevel. And the Chazan Ish is pointing out about this that this is not a violator of tithes. This is just somebody who may not be careful about the other tithes. But regarding somebody who's not trusted on tithes at all, then you can't use this procedure either, because maybe it's actual definite tevel. So we're going to get into the case of definite tevel. Actually, it's going to be coming up in the next part of this Gemara, but that's going to be in chapter 7, Halacha 5. And over here, it's not relying on brera. In the case of doing tevel, you can only do it if you accept that there's brera. So if you don't accept that there's brera, you can't make this work with tevel. If you do accept that there's brera, you can make it work for the demai or for the tevel. And if you're just doing this procedure, which doesn't rely on brera, then even if you believe in brera, they would agree that this is okay. So again, the not belief in brera is going to be the more strict view. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, but the following Mishnah says that an advanced maestros designation is allowed even in the case of definite tevel. Again, that is talking about where you already own the produce. It's in chapter 7, Halacha 5. It's the first part of the Mishnah there. And the Gemara says, we learned in the Mishnah there, it says, if one had 100 figs of tevel in the house, but on the eve of the Shabbat he was away and in the house of the study or in the field, and he's concerned that he's not going to return back in time before Shabbat to separate the tithes before Shabbat, then he should say the following. He should say, the 2 figs that I will eventually separate from the pile are hereby designated as Truma. 10 additional figs are designated as Meiser Rishon. 9 additional figs designated Meiser Sheni. And from here we can see that there's also going to be an advanced Maestros declaration for definite tevel. And you notice here, he's separating out the Truma Gedola. Now, this is what's going to be about this is that this guy actually owns the figs. And in the case of the Demai here, that you're going to the house, this food didn't even come into existence yet. It's somebody else's property. Perhaps it wasn't even cooked yet. So it didn't even come into existence. But over here, when you're, say, at the field and you have these 100 figs in your house, well, you have the 100 figs in your possession. You own them. They're yours. And that's going to be the difference between here and there. And again, one of the other differences in the case of this pre-designation is going to be where you're doing something on something that's actually going to be a deraita obligation, but it only works if you believe that there's brera, so that after the fact, these tithes are being done. It's not just a mere identification. In the case over here, it's just an identification. Over there, it's actually going to be a retroactive. It's going to be something retroactive. Now, let me finish up this, and I will explain it. The Gemara continues and says that, as a rebuttal, and says, if you should say that the Mishnah, in that Mishnah, we're also dealing exclusively with the case of Demai, you can't say it, because we learned in that very Mishnah, it says, if those figs were Demai, that's going to be the second part of the Mishnah. So over there, the Mishnah is discussing Demai in the latter case, and it's obvious that the first case talk about definite tevel. So we're seeing here also, in the case of tevel, a pre-designation. So what's going to be the difference? Well, one might wonder why the Gemara needs to infer this from the Mishnah's later clause. And when the first clause states explicitly that the person's figs are tevel, it's letting you know that we're dealing with tevel. The second part of the Mishnah says that we're dealing with Demai. So why do these indications are not enough to prove that the Mishnah is just referring to tevel over here? And the answer is that one might have interpreted the Mishnah as referring to rabbinic tevel. In other words, something that is subject to tithing only by rabbinic decree, like a product that's planted in an unperforated pot, which they also call tevel, but which requires a separation of truma along with maestros. But that's going to be by rabbinic decree. So again, the perforated pot or the unperforated pot. The unperforated pot. So the Gemara is going to be talking about this later clause, which is demonstrating that no, we're actually talking about genuine biblical tevel. And that's one of the novelties here. But again, this is going to be a case of doing it with retroactive clarification. And over here, we're not doing it that way. So the Gemara is going to answer this, tie it up. The Gemara says, did Rabbi Yochanan say that an advanced designation is permitted only with regard to Demai and not with regard to definite tevel? That's a question. And the Gemara says, no. He said this only that the specific leniency set forth in this Mishnah is limited to Demai. And basically what he's saying is that one can make an advanced maestros declaration even for definite tevel. And the Gemara is saying then, what is the difference between Demai and tevel? In other words, what's unique about our Mishnah in the case that it causes its ruling to be limited to Demai? And the Gemara says that we suspect Demai, that a person may stipulate even about, or with respect to Demai, a person may stipulate even about something that is not yet in his possession. In other words, this is one of these rabbinic leniencies. And again, over there with the figs, you own the figs. They're in your house. They're in your possession. Over here, you're making a Demai designation on something that didn't come into your possession yet. You didn't get served the food yet. Maybe he didn't cook the food yet. And with respect to definite tevel, a person may stipulate only about something that's already in his possession. So if you have a guest who's anticipating being served actual tevel on Shabbat, you can't designate the maestros in advance because it's not his yet. But with regards to something that's already going to be derabanan, like Demai, you can. Okay, so that's going to be a big part of this. Now, we're going to get into a related conversation about this. Rabbi Yanai, he was basically the teacher of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yanai had a stipulation, in other words, that he verbally designated maestros in advance for definite tevel that he planned to eat on Shabbat, but had not yet separated the maestros before Shabbat. Now again, we're talking about a case where somebody actually owns it and has it in his possession. And the Gemara says that he asked Rabbi Chia the Great, what is the law with respect to rectifying the tevel on Shabbat itself by actually separating the maestros? May I rely on my advance declaration or not? In other words, they're asking, okay, if I own this maestros, I own these figs, and I make the declaration in advance, can I actually take it out and use it and eat it? And that's what we're asking. Now the case again is different. Over here, when you're the guest, the food has not been served yet. So you're making a declaration on something that didn't even come into existence yet. It's not yours. It's not put in front of you yet. And the case over here in the figs is that the figs are in your house. You own the figs. You possess the figs. So he's asking, can you do this advanced declaration in advance on Shabbat? And Rabbi Chia the Great says in this Baraisa, he says that Scripture says you shall surely tithe the entire crop of your planting so that you will learn to fear Hashem, your God, all the days. So the phrase, all your days, is going to apply even on Shabbat. Now, there's a malokit here about the Bavli Yerushalmi, and the Bavli is going to be saying that this phrase here, fear Hashem, your God, all your days, means that you're supposed to fear Hashem, your God, 7 days a week, even on Shabbat. Over here, the Yerushalmi is trying to say that you can separate out the tithes all your days, even on Shabbat. So if you're doing this pre-declaration, and again, you have this in your possession, then you can make this kind of thing. So there's a malokit, Bavli Yerushalmi, and over here, the Yerushalmi is holding that you can do this process on Shabbat. And in other words, the Baraisa's understanding the verse is alluding to tithing in general, not specifically to Meiser Sheni. And, according to this explanation, one learns to fear Hashem by honoring Shabbat properly. And so to that end, we ensure that produce is properly tithed, and that way we can have good delicacies on Shabbat. That's what this is saying. Now, this exposition is just an asmata, it's an allusion to a rabbinic teaching, and biblically there's nothing wrong with tithing produce on Shabbat, so it is necessary for the verse to permit it. Rather, the Brisa sees in this verse an allusion that there is some exception to the usual rabbinic prohibition of separating tithes on Shabbat. And this pertains to one who made an advance declaration prior to Shabbat. That's going to be the note by Rabbi Kanievsky. Now, having resolved Rabbi Yanai's question, Rabbi Chia the Great asks him, he says, why is it that you yourself initially saw fit to be lenient in this matter, yet afterward you sought my opinion and endeavored to pin the ruling on me? So basically, Rabbi Yanai made the maestros declaration in advance on Shabbat, intending to separate the maestros on Shabbat, and he obviously considered it permitted to do so. So Rabbi Chia is asking him, why do you need to know this? Now, again, what would be the very strict thing, right? The very strict thing would be perhaps not to use this produce at all. But, maybe you have some nice delicacies that you want to have on Shabbat, and Oneg Shabbat, that's also going to be a Doraita thing. So Rabbi Yanai replies, and he says to Rabbi Chia that you are destined to exercise leadership over the people of Israel in halachic matters, and therefore your opinion is more authoritative than mine. So, in other words, Rabbi Marafulda is saying that because of your stature, it's obvious that you've been designated by heaven to become the halachic authority for all of Israel. So therefore, your halachic opinion matters and it has more weight than mine. That's effectively what he's saying. So the Gemara is going to continue a related incident that illustrates the extent to which an advanced maestros declaration is effective. And Rabbi Hoshaya had a stipulation, and he verbally designated maestros in advance for vegetables of definite tevel that he planned to eat on Shabbat. So again, now we're talking about vegetables of definite tevel. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that there was a certain woman in the area who cooked her own tevel vegetables before the Shabbos and forgot to rectify them through tithing. And she had not made the advanced stipulations, and she didn't say this in advance. So far, we've been talking about, if you're going to this house, you're going to say these words that the Mishnah is talking about in advance. And this is talking about a lady who didn't start this process in advance. And she didn't make any stipulation. And on Shabbat, she came before Rabbi Hoshaya and inquired how can she eat her cooked vegetables. And Rabbi Hoshaya, relying on his own advanced maestro stipulation, sent Zavdi ben Levi to act as his agent and rectify the vegetables for her by separating the maestros from Rabbi Hoshaya's vegetables. In other words, Rabbi Hoshaya comes along and says, look, I already made the designation, so you can use my designation. So the Gemara, of course, is wondering, how can this be done? And Rabbi Bar Marmel asks, but did Zavdi Bar Levi not need to acquire ownership of the vegetables on behalf of Rabbi Hoshaya before tithing them? In other words, if you're going by Rabbi Hoshaya's advanced maestros, and Rabbi Hoshaya didn't actually acquire them or own them, and again, we're talking about tevel, then how can this be? And shouldn't it be that Zavdi Bar Levi actually has to get ownership and make a kinyan, and that way, it will fit together with Rabbi Hoshaya's predesignation? And the Gemara responds, Rabbi Zera analyzed the matter and responded, and it says, what case are we dealing with? What are the precise circumstances of the case? And it says, if it was a situation where Rabbi Hoshaya made a stipulation regarding his own produce and regarding the produce of others, then Zavdi Bar Levi did not need to acquire ownership of the vegetables on Rabbi Hoshaya's behalf before tithing them. Why? Because he's able to rely on Rabbi Hoshaya's stipulation to tithe even the woman's produce. In other words, let's say, according to Rabbi Zera, that he made a stipulation for his own vegetables, and he said in this advanced stipulation, and also, anyone else who needs in the community. That's why, basically, Rabbi Hoshaya's stipulation, according to Rabbi Zera, would work, and Rabbi Zavdi Bar Levi doesn't need to acquire it. So the Gemara is going to continue to say, and if it was a situation where Rabbi Hoshaya had a stipulation only regarding his own produce and not regarding the produce of others, then indeed, Zavdi Bar Levi would have needed to acquire ownership of the vegetables of Rabbi Hoshaya's behalf. So in other words, according to Rabbi Zera, if he made a general stipulation, not only covering his own food in advance of Shabbat, but also somebody else's in the communities, then Zavdi Bar Levi doesn't need to acquire it. But if he didn't make this advanced stipulation for anyone else in the community, then Zavdi Bar Levi has to acquire ownership of the vegetables on Rabbi Hoshaya's behalf in order to tithe them on Shabbat. Why? Because otherwise it's not part of Rabbi Hoshaya's maestro stipulation. And the question is, did Zavdi Bar Levi acquire the vegetables or not? And, was he able to separate tithes from Rabbi Hoshaya's produce to exempt this woman's produce? So there's a dissenting opinion about this, and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi, in the name of Rabbi Abahu, objects to Rabbi Hoshaya's ruling, and it says, but Zavdi ben Levi did not acquire ownership of the vegetables on behalf of Rabbi Hoshaya. So basically the question is, how could Zavdi ben Levi have tithed them? So even if Rabbi Hoshaya, according to Rabbi Abahu, made a stipulation that encompassed the produce of others, he's saying it's ineffective because when Rabbi Hoshaya instructed Zavdi ben Levi to tithe the woman's produce without instructing him to first acquire it on his behalf, Rabbi Hoshaya made a mistake. Now, that's going to, again, talk about what we're going to be covering in Chapter 7, Halacha 5, that if you're having a case of tevel, you have to have it in your possession. So, and the case of making this sort of declaration, like what we're talking about in this Mishnah, is talking about food that didn't come into your possession yet, and that's why we're talking about Demai, right? Demai is going to be lenient, and so you make this advanced declaration, it didn't come into your possession yet, so you can do it. But in the case of tevel, it has to be in your possession. And the Mishnah then stated that if a guest does not trust his Shabbos host regarding maestros, he must make his own maestro stipulation before Shabbat. And the Gemara is going to give further instructions on how the guest does it. Rabbi Yanai says, on the Sabbath, when the guest partakes of the meal and separates a tithe portion, he must remember his previous stipulation. So Mara Fulda says about this, in order to be allowed to separate 1/100th of what he served as a tithe portion on Shabbat, the guest must remember the stipulation he made before. That seems obvious, but why is that going to be the case? Well, part of why that's the case is that you have to have this act as part of this previous thing that you started before Shabbat, and that's part of the important part of this process. The Gemara is going to explain this further. Rabbi Shimon Bar Va says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and when he separates a tithe portion, he must whisper the stipulation with his lips. So Rabbi Yochanan here is clarifying that when Rabbi Yanai said the guest must remember the stipulation, he meant that when separating the tithes, the guest must actually repeat the stipulation in undertone. And the purpose of repeating this, says the Mara Panim, is going to be to clarify that the portion he separates is actually Trumas Meiser that he designated the day before. And once he identifies the portion, it becomes Trumas Meiser automatically on the basis of this pre-Shabbat designation. And again, you're not making a new designation. All you're doing is you're relying on the original designation, but you're just identifying the portion. That's all you're doing. So there's going to be a challenge that gets raised. Rabbi Yerushalmi raised a question before Rabbi Zera, and it says, if one must verbalize his original stipulation again on Shabbat, when he separates this tithe portion, then is he not found to appear like one who rectifies his produce tithing on Shabbat? Rabbi Zera answers. He says to Rabbi Yerushalmi, indeed, I shall reject this teaching, for actually one should not repeat the stipulation on Shabbat, even in a whisper. So that's going to be a surprise. So according to this other version of the text, Rabbi Zera is stating that when he whispers the designation again, it looks like he's maybe involved in doing this designation anew, and maybe you want to just do this pre-designation in silence and not do it aloud, and according to that version of the text, it would look like an act that you're doing today. So the Gemara is going to now focus on the rule that on Shabbat a guest is going to set aside tithes. So again, if to sum that one up, according to the Vilna Goan, the Gemara's conclusion is that the guest does not need to repeat the stipulation on Shabbat, but he's just going to merely separate the pre-designation tithe portion in silence. That's how the Vilna Goan understands the conclusion of this Gemara, so that you're not going to actually repeat it verbally. So as the Vilna Gaon's pointing out, he does not agree with Shimon Bar Va's understanding of what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, and basically Rabbi Zera is agreeing with Rabbi Yerushalmi that it becomes problematic to actually verbally recite it again, because it's like somebody who's actually tithing it on Shabbat. It's like you've started this process all over again. So the Gemara now is going to focus on this next rule that on Shabbat, the guest sets aside 1/100th of the portion that he's served as Trumas Meiser. This, by the way, is what we're talking about in the Mishnah. It's in the Mishnah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raised another question for Rabbi Zera and said, but is it not forbidden to leave over the Truma Meiser because of the prohibition of destroying food? So we have a rule, don't have Bal Tashris. And so if you have Trumas Meiser that's forbidden to non-Kohanim, has to be thrown on the floor, and it's inedible. And you have to throw it on the floor so that the host and the family doesn't accidentally eating it. So isn't this really just a destruction of food? And again, keep in mind that, this is going to be a rabbinic thing on Demai. And Rabbi Zera responds back to Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, in this case, he first crumbles the tithe portion into minute pieces of less than the olive's volume each, and then he's permitted to destroy it. So why is it that the prohibition against wasting food applies only to items that are going to be an olive volume or larger? Because that's going to be the status for ochel, right? We know this from Masechet Yoma, and we know this for Yom Kippur. What is ochlin? What does it mean to eat? It means to eat something that's at least an olive portion. So what Rabbi Zera says is make it smaller than the olive portion, and then it's not fit to eat. And because it's not fit to eat, you can put it on the floor because it's not considered, it's not an olive volume, which is going to be considered for food. So Rabbi Yirmiyah persists, and Rabbi Yirmiyah raises another question for Rabbi Zera. He says, but is it not forbidden on account of stealing to destroy the Meiser, the Trumas Meiser? So we know that the guest was invited to eat, and at some point he has to give out the tithes, right? And he's not there to destroy food. He's not there to take food from the host and also to take it away from the tribes. And Rabbi Zera responds and replies. He said to Rabbi Yirmiyah that the host wants his guest to have satisfaction in his home, and he doesn't mind if he attains satisfaction by wasting some of his portion. Now, again, this is only a rabbinic leniency on Demai. You can't do this with definite tevel. So the Gemara is going to challenge Rabbi Zera's answer. We're going to be finishing up pretty quickly. The following incident is going to be with two rabbis. It's going to be Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yudah. And it's going to contradict Rabbi Zera's claim that the host desires the guest's satisfaction in any event. And it says, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yitzhak, recounted and said, Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yudah, were being hosted by a certain householder. And a slanderer went to the host and told him, pay attention during the meal, and you will see that the rabbis suspect you of being an Amma Haaretz and negligence during the tithing. And, before eating anything, they're going to separate their own tithes and destroy them. So, wow, that's, quite a Hilul Hashem to say that about the rabbis. So the Gemara says that the host sat down at the meal and carefully watched them to see if that was true. And realizing that they were being observed, Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi made themselves appear as if they were playing with the food by tossing small pieces back and forth to each other. And in this matter, they inconspicuously rectified the produce by designating the crumbs that fell off as tithes and letting them be destroyed. So the Gemara continues, says, and now what did the host not want from them to have satisfaction or to do as they please? And the Gemara says, why did he watch them keenly? And, why was he watching to see if he would destroy it? So the Gemara is going to answer this. It's going to say that the host does want his guests to have satisfaction, even if it means that they tie their portions and destroy what they separate. So the Gemara says, but in the case that the host did not want the rabbis to suspect him of negligence regard to tithing, therefore, when they told them that they did not suspect him, he made a point of watching him to see if it was true. And in the case where the host had no inkling that the guest actually suspected him of not tithing him, and he was only seeing if he's wasting the portion. And in that case, like for a normal person, like a normal host, he's not going to object. In other words, the guy was sitting there seeing, do these rabbis think that I'm an haaretz or not? And we're going to be finishing up this Art Scroll Daf, and that's going to finish up Chapter 7, Halacha 1. So the Mishnah stated that a guest may stipulate about the host's produce before Shabbat in order to separate the tithe portion. Now, again, we're talking about a case of Demai, and when you're starting this process on tithing before Shabbat, but the host maybe didn't even cook the food yet, and it didn't come into your possession yet. It didn't get put onto your plate yet. You're doing this before. Maybe you're going to eat the meal Saturday afternoon, and you're starting this process 2 hours before Shabbat to tithe for the food that you're going to eat Saturday afternoon. So this is going to be a related concept. The Gemara is going to say, it was taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda forbids one to rely on this kind of stipulation. What is Rabbi Yehuda's reason? He maintains, can a person possibly stipulate about something that's not yet in his possession? He's saying you can't. So basically he's saying that you can't stipulate that he's designating maestros in advance for a portion that will be served on Shabbat. And Rabbi Yehuda concedes that the guest may go and purchase similar produce from the same place where the host purchased his produce and tithe from the purchased produce, which is in his possession, to exempt the host produce. So let's clarify this a bit. The Chazan Ish is saying like this. He's saying that Rabbi Yehuda holds that one cannot stipulate about produce that is not in his possession, and he's conceding that one can exempt produce that is not in his possession, and basically the way that you're going to do it in order to exempt this Demai that he's going to be served on Shabbat is the guest can go purchase his own Demai from the host supplier, designating tithes on this one before Shabbat, and then basically it's going to exempt the portion of Demai that he's going to be served the next day. So this new Demai has to be purchased from the same source where the host is purchasing his produce, because as we learned, that one may not tithe one pile of Demai to exempt a different pile of Demai. So that's why you're going to the same supplier. And Rabbi Kanievsky says that if the host purchase was not purchased but comes from his own crop, then the guest is unable to exempt the host's produce. So you have to be able, there's certain conditions on what's going to make this work. You have to go get from the same supplier. And again, you can't separate one pile of Demai for another pile of Demai. Why? Because not all the tithes might be equally taken out. This pile of Demai might have had everything taken out except for the Meiser Sheni, and this pile might just have the Truma Gedola taken out. So the Gemara is going to wonder why Rabbi Yehuda permits the later method, where you're going to the same supplier and you're getting that into your possession, and then you're tithing from this Demai from the same supplier onto the food that you're going to be getting fed, let's say on Saturday afternoon. The Gemara says, but is it possible that a person can separate tithes even from his own produce to exempt something that is not his? And surely one is not authorized to tithe another produce without his consent. So how does the guest separate the tithe portion from his own purchased produce to exempt the host's produce? So we talked about this before. What happens if you're going to try to tithe somebody else's produce without consent? That only works if you're improving the produce, or if the person's not going to mind. So the Gemara answers that while generally one may not separate tithes from his own produce to exempt someone else's produce, Rabbi Yehuda permits it here because ours is an exceptional case. And again, you're going to be a guest here, and part of it is that the host is going to want you to enjoy being there. So the Gemara is going to read like this. Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that they treated this guest like someone who inadvertently sells tevel produce to his fellow and can't find him. And in that case, he's allowed to exempt him. So the Gemara says, we were taught in the following brisa, if someone mistakenly sells tevel to his fellow, he must run after the buyer and rectify the produce by separating the tithes. So let's say you have a store and you accidentally sold tevel to somebody and the guy walked out the store with tevel. What do? So it says you have to run after the buyer and rectify the produce. Now the Gemara says if the seller pursued the buyer and couldn't find him, then the rule is like this. If it is known that the produce still exists and it wasn't eaten yet, he must separate tithes from his own produce for the produce that he sold. And if he knows that the produce no longer exists, then he does not have to separate tithes from his own produce for that produce. So in other words, if it still exists, you go and you take extra tevel that you didn't tithe yet, and you tithe on this one for that one, and then you're fixing it. And since there's no other way, says Rabbi Kanievsky, to rectify this error, he's allowed to exempt the buyer's produce by separating the tithes for it from within his own produce. And in this situation, it's going to be beneficial to the buyer to have the seller tithe on his behalf, and so his consent is taken for granted. So the idea is that the buyer's unaware that he purchased tevel, and he's in danger of committing a transgression. Why? Because it's the seller's error. And it's incumbent on the seller to make those kinds of tithes. And when the seller realizes he's being basically required to go and tithe on behalf of the seller or the buyer. So the buyer, he didn't make a mistake. He's assuming that the seller is rectifying the tithes. He assumes that he rectified the tithes. The seller is supposed to rectify the tithes. The buyer is walking home to cook his food, and he assumes it's just fine. The seller has to go and rectify this. So in the case where it's too late to rectify the produce and one can't tithe it, there's no point of having the seller separate out tithes. Now, the Gemara is going to finish up, and it's going to say, if it's unknown whether the produce still exists or it does not exist, he must separate the tithes from his own produce for that produce out of doubt. And the Gemara says, but in this last case, since the tithes are questionable status, he must also designate the tithes for these so-called tithes. In other words, he's going to bring additional tevel. He's going to designate tithes within that tevel to rectify the tithes that was in the product he was supposed to tithe. And basically this Bryce is teaching that if the buyer can't be located and the produce still exists, then the seller separates the tithes for it without his own permission. And basically there's no other option. And Rabbi Yehuda is basically treating the case of Shabbat and the Shabbat guest like that. Basically he's going to be permitting the guest to designate tithes within his own produce before Shabbat to exempt the portion of the host produce that's going to be served on Shabbat. So really, Pnei Moshe says that since the host had no intention of tithing the produce, the guest's tithing is deemed to be beneficial for him, and his consent may be assumed. So that's only, by the way, going to be dealing with a case where you're talking about for Demai, and you're only, because there's leniencies here, and you're talking about a case where you have something in advance to tithe, and again, what you're doing on Shabbat is you're just identifying from the process that you already started. And again, this is going to be a process that assumes that there is no brera, because again, you've started this process on the rabbinic thing, which is going to be lenient anyway. You started it, and you said, okay, I'm just identifying it. I've started the process, and this portion that's going to be on the north side, this is going to be what I started on the process before, and it's not a retroactive clarification. Have a great day.